She came from nothing, but she was becoming everything. Top grades, athletic excellence, a scholarship that could lift her entire family out of poverty. Across the room stood another girl, wealthy, celebrated, always second place, raised to believe losing was impossible, especially to someone she considered beneath her. The school knew about the allergy. The danger was documented. What happened next was not a mistake. It was a decision made in anger, one that would change two families forever. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Destiny Marie Crawford came into this world on September 3, 2000 at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Her mother, Lorraine Crawford, was just 22 years old and completely alone in that delivery room. The man who should have been there, Destiny's father, had walked out 3 months before she was born, leaving Lorraine to face motherhood without a partner, without support, and without a safety net. But Lorraine was not the kind of woman who gave up easily. She held her newborn daughter in her arms that night and made a promise that she would give this child everything she never had, even if it meant sacrificing everything she was. Destiny was the second of what would eventually become 5 children in the Crawford household. 4 girls and 1 boy, all raised in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Ridgewood, Georgia. The walls were thin, the rent was always due, and there was never quite enough of anything to go around. Lorraine worked double shifts at a textile factory 6 days a week, her hands calloused from the machinery, her back aching from standing for 12 hours at a time. She would come home exhausted, but she never complained. She couldn't afford to complain. There were mouths to feed and bills to pay, and complaining didn't put food on the table. By the time Destiny was 7 years old, she had already learned responsibilities that most children her age couldn't even spell. While other kids played after school, she was at home helping raise her younger siblings. She learned to cook before she learned long division. She learned to change diapers before she learned to ride a bike. She became a second mother in that household, and she did it without resentment because she understood, even at that young age, that her family's survival depended on everyone pulling their weight. But teachers at her elementary school noticed something remarkable about this quiet girl from the east side. Destiny was exceptional. She wasn't just keeping up with her classmates. She was leaving them behind. She read 2 grade levels ahead of where she should have been. She finished tests before other students had completed half the questions. Her mind was sharp, her focus was intense, and her determination was unshakable. But academics weren't where she truly shone. That discovery came in 4th grade, during a school field day that would change the trajectory of her entire life. When the races began that afternoon, Destiny entered every single one. And she won every single one. It wasn't even close. A physical education teacher named Mr. Harold Washington pulled her aside after the final race, his eyes wide with recognition of something special. "You have a gift," he told her, "something that can't be taught." He explained that her stride was naturally efficient, that her body seemed designed for speed in a way that couldn't be manufactured or trained into someone. By 5th grade, she was competing against 7th and 8th graders and beating them handily. By 7th grade, she was breaking school records that had been set by high schoolers years before her. Then, at age 9, Destiny almost died. A neighbor had offered her a cookie containing peanut butter, an innocent gesture that nearly ended her life. Within minutes of eating it, her throat began to close. Her lips swelled grotesquely. Her skin turned an angry red, and she couldn't breathe. Lorraine rushed her to the emergency room in a panic, where doctors administered epinephrine just in time to save her. The diagnosis was devastating: severe peanut allergy with anaphylaxis risk. From that day forward, Lorraine became hyper-vigilant about her daughter's safety. She informed every school, every teacher, every coach about the condition. Destiny carried an EpiPen everywhere she went, like it was an extension of her own body. The allergy was documented in her school file with a red flag designation, and everyone who needed to know about it absolutely knew. But someone would eventually use that knowledge as a weapon. Now, before we continue with Destiny's incredible journey, If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Now let's continue. On the other side of Ridgewood, in a world that might as well have been a different planet, another girl was born just 6 weeks before Destiny. Brittany Elizabeth Thornton entered this world on July 19, 2000, not in a crowded public hospital, but in a private birthing center in Buckhead, Atlanta, where the rooms looked like luxury hotel suites and the nurses catered to every whim. Her father, Gregory Thornton, was a commercial real estate developer whose net worth hovered around $40 million. Her mother, Suzanne, was a former beauty queen who now spent her days chairing charity boards and attending society luncheons. Brittany was their only child, and from the moment she took her first breath, they made absolutely certain she understood just how special that made her. Gregory had not always been wealthy. He grew up middle class in a small town in Alabama, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher who scraped by on modest incomes. But he had ambition that burned like a furnace, and he clawed his way to the top through aggressive business tactics, strategic connections, and marriages that served his interests more than his heart. His first wife had been useful for her family's business contacts. His second wife brought social connections that money alone couldn't buy. Suzanne was his third, and she came with a family name that opened doors even $40 million couldn't unlock. Gregory believed in one principle above all others, a philosophy he drilled into his daughter from the time she could understand words. There are winners, and there are losers. There are people who matter, and people who don't. He told Brittany countless times throughout her childhood. You were born to matter. Never let anyone forget that. She attended exclusive private schools until 5th grade, surrounded by children whose parents were equally wealthy, equally privileged, equally convinced of their own superiority. She had personal tutors for subjects she struggled with, dance instructors to refine her grace, and a gymnastics coach who traveled with the family to competitions. She was told she was beautiful by everyone who wanted something from her parents. She was told she was talented by coaches who were paid to say so. She was told she was destined for greatness by a father who couldn't accept any other outcome. But what she was never told, not once in her entire pampered existence, was the word no. When she placed second in a regional gymnastics competition at age 10, Gregory didn't comfort her. He demanded a recount, accused the judges of bias, and threatened to sue the organization. When she lost a spelling bee at age 11, Suzanne blamed the moderator for speaking too quickly. Brittany learned early that losing was not just unacceptable, it was always someone else's fault. In 2013, the Thorntons made a calculated decision that would eventually lead to tragedy. They transferred their daughter from her private school to Jefferson Ridge High School, a public institution that served both the wealthy west side and the working-class east side of Ridgewood. The reason wasn't academic, it was strategic. Jefferson Ridge had a nationally ranked cheerleading program that attracted college scouts and media attention. A championship at a private school meant nothing compared to the spotlight of a public school victory. Gregory wanted his daughter seen, celebrated, and recruited by the best universities in the country. Jefferson Ridge would be her stage, and everyone else would be her audience. She arrived with a reputation that preceded her. Designer clothes that cost more than some family's monthly rent. A brand new Mercedes-Benz waiting for her on her 16th birthday. Stories of summer vacations in Paris and winter breaks in Switzerland. She established herself at the top of the social hierarchy almost immediately, her wealth and confidence acting as a magnet for those who wanted proximity to power. She became co-captain of the cheerleading squad by sophomore year and joined the track team, not because she loved running, but because she loved crossing the finish line first. And for 2 glorious years, she won everything she entered. Until a girl from the east side started breaking records she couldn't touch. And that girl's name was Destiny Crawford. February 12, 2018, began like any other Monday at Jefferson Ridge. Students shuffled through the hallways half awake, teachers clutched their coffee cups like lifelines, and the morning announcements droned through the intercom system. But this Monday would be different. This Monday would change everything. Principal Eleanor Whitmore had called a special assembly in the gymnasium, and by third period, over 1,200 students had filed into the bleachers, buzzing with speculation about what announcement could possibly warrant pulling everyone out of class. Principal Whitmore stood at the podium, a smile playing at the corners of her lips as she waited for the noise to settle. When silence finally fell over the gymnasium, she spoke words that would echo through the halls for years to come. One of their own had been selected for something extraordinary. One of their students had earned a full athletic and academic scholarship to Stanford University. Not a partial scholarship that would still leave a family scrambling for tuition money. Not a conditional offer that could be revoked on a technicality. A full ride. 4 years. Every expense paid. Room, board, books, and fees. The recipient of this life-changing opportunity was a junior from the East Side, a girl who had represented the school in both athletics and academics with distinction that had captured the attention of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The recipient was Destiny Marie Crawford. The gymnasium erupted in thunderous applause. Destiny's teammates from the track team rushed to embrace her, their cheers drowning out the noise of the crowd. Coach Beverly Simmons, the woman who had watched her develop from a promising freshman into a record-breaking phenomenon, wiped tears from her eyes unashamedly. In the stands, Lorraine had taken a rare day off from the textile factory to witness this moment. She watched her daughter stand on that stage, the same girl who used to help with homework while stirring dinner for 4 hungry siblings, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that her daughter would have a life she never could. That sacrifice and hard work actually meant something in this world, but not everyone in that gymnasium shared in the celebration. Brittany sat in the 3rd row of the bleachers, surrounded by her cheerleading squad, and she did not clap. She did not smile. She did not move a single muscle. She simply stared at Destiny with an expression that her friends would later describe to investigators as pure, undiluted hatred. The kind of hatred that doesn't fade with time. The kind that festers and grows until it becomes something dangerous. After the assembly ended and students began filtering back to their classes, she walked directly to the nearest bathroom and didn't emerge for 30 minutes. When she finally came out, her eyes were red and swollen. Her friends weren't sure if she had been crying or screaming, but they knew better than to ask. That evening, she called her father from her bedroom. Phone records would later confirm the call lasted 17 minutes. "She got Stanford," she told him, her voice trembling with rage. "The full scholarship, the one I was supposed to get." Gregory's response was immediate and exactly what his daughter needed to hear to validate her fury. "She cheated," he said without hesitation. "There's no way someone like that gets Stanford on merit. Someone made a call. Someone pulled strings. People like her don't earn things like this." People like her. Someone like that. Phrases she had heard her entire life to describe people from the other side of town. People without money. People who didn't belong in the same rooms as their family. Gregory promised to make phone calls, to investigate, to find out what really happened. But there was nothing to find. Destiny had earned her scholarship through excellence alone, through years of training and studying and pushing herself beyond what anyone thought possible. And that truth, more than anything else, was what Brittany could not accept. Over the following weeks, something inside her began to change. Something dark. Something deadly. In the weeks following the scholarship announcement, the Thornton household became a pressure cooker of resentment and rage. Gregory had made his phone calls, pulled every string he could reach, and come up empty-handed. There was no scandal to uncover, no corruption to expose, no technicality to exploit. Stanford University had reviewed Destiny's academic transcripts, her athletic achievements, her community service record, and her personal essays. They had watched footage of her breaking state records on the track. They had read letters of recommendation from teachers who described her as one of the most remarkable students they had ever encountered. The admissions committee had made their decision based on merit alone, and there was absolutely nothing Gregory could do about it. But accepting defeat was not something this family did. It wasn't in their vocabulary. It wasn't in their blood. Gregory's philosophy had always been simple and brutal. Rules exist for people who can't afford to break them. He had been investigated by the IRS 3 separate times throughout his career, and each time he had emerged unscathed, his army of accountants and lawyers constructing walls of paperwork that investigators couldn't penetrate. He had been sued by former business partners on 6 different occasions, men who claimed he had cheated them out of millions, and he had never lost a single case. Not because he was innocent, but because he understood how the system worked and how to make it work for him. This was the philosophy he had instilled in his daughter from childhood. This was the lens through which she saw the world. And when she complained about the unfairness of a girl she considered beneath her receiving something she believed she deserved, Gregory didn't counsel acceptance or grace. He counseled action. If someone takes what's yours, he told her, you take it back, by any means necessary. Suzanne, for her part, had perfected the art of willful blindness over 20 years of marriage. She didn't see her husband's affairs with younger women, though the evidence was often blatant. She didn't see her daughter's cruelty toward classmates she deemed inferior, though teachers had called with concerns multiple times. She saw only the image she wanted to project to the world: the perfect family, the perfect marriage, the perfect daughter. When Brittany came home angry and bitter after the assembly, Suzanne offered hollow platitudes about rising above petty jealousy. When she mentioned the girl from the East Side with venom in her voice, Suzanne simply changed the subject to something more pleasant. She never asked what her daughter was planning. She never probed into the darkness that was taking root. She didn't want to know. Knowing would have required her to act, and acting would have disrupted the carefully constructed fantasy she called her life. In the 2 weeks following the announcement, Brittany conducted research that would later become critical evidence in her prosecution. She spent hours on her laptop, searching for information about severe allergies and their consequences. She learned that peanut allergies were among the most dangerous, capable of triggering anaphylactic shock within minutes of exposure. She learned that without immediate treatment, the reaction could cause death in as little as 15 minutes. She learned that schools were legally required to keep epinephrine autoinjectors accessible for students with documented allergies, but that response times varied depending on where the emergency occurred. And she learned through careful observation and casual questions to mutual acquaintances exactly which locker belonged to Destiny Crawford. Prosecutors would later investigate whether she acted alone in what happened next. Several of her friends were brought in for questioning, and while none would ultimately face charges, their testimony revealed a disturbing truth. At least 2 girls knew that something was being planned. One admitted that Brittany had asked her to keep Destiny distracted on the morning of March 14th. Another admitted seeing her near Destiny's locker before first period that day. Neither girl reported what they knew. Neither girl tried to stop what was coming. They claimed they didn't think she was actually serious. That excuse would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far into the story, type "I am still here" so we can see who's really paying attention. Let's continue. March 14th, 2018, dawned gray and overcast in Ridgewood, Georgia, the kind of morning that made people want to stay in bed a few extra minutes. At 5:30 a.m., while most of the town still slept, Lorraine's alarm clock shattered the silence in the small apartment on the east side. She rose the way she always did, with a groan and a prayer, her body protesting another day of standing on concrete floors for 12 hours. But there were mouths to feed and bills that wouldn't pay themselves, so she pushed through the exhaustion the way she had pushed through every obstacle life had thrown at her for the past 17 years. She shuffled to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast for her 5 children, the familiar routine providing a small comfort in the pre-dawn darkness. Before leaving for her shift at the factory, Lorraine stopped by Destiny's bedroom door. Her daughter was already awake, reviewing notes for a calculus test she had first period. Lorraine felt a swell of pride looking at this remarkable young woman she had raised, this girl who had overcome every disadvantage to earn a full scholarship to one of the best universities in the country. "Don't forget your EpiPen," she reminded her, the same words she had spoken every school morning for the past 8 years. Destiny smiled and patted her backpack where the life-saving device was stored. "I'm proud of you," Lorraine said, lingering in the doorway for just a moment longer than usual. "I love you." Those would be the last words she spoke to her daughter before tragedy struck. She had no way of knowing that by the time her shift ended, her entire world would be shattered beyond recognition. Destiny arrived at school at 7:15 a.m., earlier than most students, because she wanted extra time to review her calculus formulas before the test. The hallways were mostly empty as she walked to her locker, her footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. Locker number 247 looked exactly the same as it had every other day of her junior year. She spun the combination lock with practiced ease, pulled open the metal door, and retrieved her calculus textbook from the top shelf. She noticed nothing unusual. The peanuts that would nearly kill her had been placed deep inside, hidden behind her gym bag where they wouldn't be immediately visible. She closed her locker, completely unaware of the danger lurking inches away, and headed to first period to ace her test. 25 minutes earlier, at approximately 7:20 a.m., Brittany had been captured on the school's security cameras walking through the sophomore hallway. This was unusual because she was a junior, and her locker was located in a completely different wing of the building. She had no legitimate reason to be in that hallway at that hour. The security footage showed a figure in a cheerleading jacket approaching locker 247. The figure appeared to enter a combination, open the locker door, and place something inside. The figure then closed the locker and walked away quickly, head down, avoiding direct eye contact with the camera. The footage was grainy, captured from an oblique angle that never showed the face clearly. But the cheerleading jacket was unmistakable, and so was the small plastic bag clutched in the figure's hand. First period passed without incident. Destiny completed her calculus test with confidence, certain she had aced it. Second period came and went, bringing her closer to the moment that would define the rest of her life. Third period was physical education, and she needed to retrieve her gym clothes from her locker before heading to afternoon track practice. At exactly 11:42 a.m., she returned to locker 247 and opened it for the second time that day. She reached inside for her gym bag, and her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Small, hard objects scattered across the bottom of her locker. Objects that hadn't been there that morning. She looked down to see what they were. Peanuts. Dozens of them. Some whole, some crushed into dust that was already floating in the air, already coating her hands, already entering her lungs with every breath she took. And in that terrible moment, Destiny understood exactly what was happening to her. Anaphylaxis does not negotiate. It does not wait for help to arrive. It does not care about scholarships or dreams or the future that stretches out before a 17-year-old girl with everything to live for. The moment those peanut particles entered Destiny's system, her body declared war on itself. Within 60 seconds of that first breath of contaminated air, her immune system launched a catastrophic overreaction that would bring her to the edge of death. Her airways began to constrict, like someone was slowly tightening a noose around her throat from the inside. Her lips swelled to twice their normal size. Her tongue felt thick and foreign in her mouth, blocking the screams she desperately wanted to release. Angry red hives erupted across her skin like wildfire spreading through dry brush, and every breath became a battle she was rapidly losing. She stumbled out of the locker bay and into the main hallway, her vision blurring at the edges as her blood pressure plummeted. She tried to call for help, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a strangled whisper, inaudible over the noise of students changing classes. Her EpiPen, the device that could save her life, was tucked safely in her backpack, which was still sitting inside locker 247. She had grabbed her gym bag but left the backpack behind, a decision made in the span of half a second that would cost her more than she could possibly imagine. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor at 11:47 a.m. on March 14, 2018. A freshman named Tyler Morrison was walking to his fourth period class when he witnessed something that would stay with him forever. He saw an older girl he recognized from the track team suddenly drop to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She just dropped, he would later testify, his voice still shaking from the memory. Like someone turned off a switch. Tyler didn't understand what was happening at first. He thought maybe she had fainted or tripped. But when he got closer and saw her swollen face, her blue-tinged lips, her chest heaving with desperate attempts to breathe, he knew this was something far worse than fainting. He turned and ran faster than he had ever run in his life, screaming for a teacher, for anyone who could help. Gloria Patterson, an English teacher who had been grading papers in her classroom, heard Tyler's frantic cries and rushed into the hallway. What she found would haunt her nightmares for years. Destiny was unconscious, her body convulsing slightly, foam forming at the corners of her mouth. Gloria dropped to her knees and began performing CPR, her training from a summer first aid course kicking in automatically. Another teacher called 911 while a third sprinted toward the nurse's office on the other side of the building to retrieve the emergency EpiPen that the school kept on hand for exactly this kind of situation. But the nurse's office was a 3-minute run away, and every second that passed was another second of oxygen deprivation to Destiny's brain and vital organs. By the time the EpiPen arrived and was administered, her heart had stopped beating twice. Paramedics arrived at 11:56 a.m., 9 agonizing minutes after the initial 911 call. They found a 17-year-old girl in full cardiac arrest, surrounded by teachers performing CPR and students watching in horror through classroom windows. They administered additional epinephrine. They performed chest compressions with mechanical precision. They intubated her right there on the gymnasium floor where she had been moved, sliding a breathing tube down her swollen throat to force air into her failing lungs. At 12:04 p.m., she was loaded into an ambulance, her heart beating again, but barely, her body ravaged by the allergic reaction and the subsequent oxygen deprivation. She arrived at Ridgewood General Hospital at 12:18 p.m. and was immediately rushed to the intensive care unit. The doctors who received her knew they were fighting against time, against biology, against odds that grew longer with every passing minute. And somewhere across town, completely unaware that her daughter was dying, Lorraine continued her shift at the factory. The intensive care unit was a place where hope and despair coexisted in equal measure, where families prayed for miracles while doctors fought against the relentless mathematics of mortality. Destiny arrived in this sterile battleground at 12:18 p.m., her body broken but still clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. She was immediately surrounded by a team of physicians and nurses who worked with practiced urgency, connecting her to machines that would breathe for her, monitor her heart, and pump medications through her veins. For 11 hours, she remained unconscious, suspended in a twilight state between life and death, while the people who loved her could do nothing but wait and pray. Lorraine arrived at the hospital at 1:15 p.m., still wearing her work uniform from the textile factory. Her supervisor had pulled her off the floor with a grave expression and simply said, "You need to get to the hospital. It's your daughter." No other details. No explanation of what had happened or how serious it was. She drove the 15 minutes in a state of numb terror, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had survived poverty. She had survived abandonment. She had survived raising 5 children alone on a factory worker's salary, but nothing in her 39 years of hard living had prepared her for what she saw when she walked into that ICU room. Her daughter, her brilliant, beautiful, unstoppable daughter, lay motionless on a hospital bed, tubes snaking from her mouth and arms, machines beeping in a rhythm that seemed to mock the silence of her unconscious form. Lorraine's legs gave out beneath her, and a nurse had to help her to a chair before she collapsed completely. The lead physician on the case was Dr. Samuel Brennan, a critical care specialist with 20 years of experience treating the worst cases that came through these doors. He had seen gunshot wounds and car accidents and overdoses, but he had rarely seen a case as complex as what lay before him now. The allergic reaction itself, while severe, was only the beginning of Destiny's medical nightmare. The prolonged period without oxygen had caused widespread damage throughout her body. Her heart had stopped twice before paramedics even arrived at the school, and each minute without adequate blood flow meant more brain cells dying, more organ tissue being destroyed, more of her slipping away. Dr. Brennan explained all of this to Lorraine in the gentlest terms he could manage, but there was no gentle way to tell a mother that her daughter might not survive the night. The most devastating complication was something called circulatory shock. Her blood pressure had dropped so catastrophically low during the allergic reaction that blood flow to her extremities had been severely compromised. Her hands and feet were cold to the touch when she arrived, and they were beginning to turn a sickly blue color that Dr. Brennan recognized immediately as a very bad sign. The medical team administered fluids and vasopressors, medications designed to constrict blood vessels and force blood pressure back up to sustainable levels. They worked through the night and into the next day, fighting a battle against her damaged circulatory system. But despite their best efforts, the damage to her lower legs was already done. The tissue had been without adequate blood flow for too long. It was beginning to die, cell by cell, inch by inch, and there was nothing modern medicine could do to reverse it. Lorraine did not leave the hospital for 6 days. She slept in an uncomfortable chair beside her daughter's bed, waking at every beep of the monitors, every footstep in the hallway, every change in the rhythm of the machines keeping Destiny alive. Her other 4 children stayed with relatives, confused and frightened, asking questions that no one could answer. She held her daughter's hand and talked to her even though she couldn't respond, telling her about Stanford, about the future, about all the dreams that were waiting for her on the other side of this nightmare. She promised that everything would be okay. She had no idea that she was making a promise she couldn't keep. If you're finding value in this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with your loved ones. A story like this could help protect someone you care about from a similar tragedy. Knowledge saves lives. Now, let's continue. 3 days after Destiny collapsed in that hallway, Dr. Samuel Brennan called a family meeting that would force Lorraine to make the most devastating decision of her life. The conference room on the 4th floor was small and windowless, designed for privacy during conversations that no family should ever have to endure. Lorraine sat at the head of the table, flanked by her sister Rhonda Matthews on one side and Reverend James Whitfield, the family's pastor, on the other. Dr. Brennan sat across from them, his face bearing the weight of the news he was about to deliver. Also present was Dr. Anthony Phillips, an orthopedic surgeon who had been consulting on the case. The presence of a surgeon in that room told Lorraine everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Dr. Brennan began by explaining what had happened to Destiny's legs over the past 72 hours. The circulatory shock caused by the allergic reaction had deprived her lower extremities of adequate blood flow for too long. The tissue damage was severe and, more importantly, irreversible. Despite aggressive treatment with blood thinners, vasodilators, and hyperbaric oxygen therapy, the cells in her legs below the knee had begun to necrotize. They were dying, and dead tissue in the body behaves like poison. If left untreated, the necrotic tissue would release toxins into her bloodstream, leading to sepsis, multiple organ failure, and ultimately death. Dr. Brennan paused to let this information sink in, watching Lorraine's face carefully for signs that she understood the gravity of what he was saying. "Mrs. Crawford," he said quietly, "we have 2 options. We can wait and hope for a miracle that, in my professional opinion, is not coming. Or we can perform emergency surgery to remove the damaged tissue and save your daughter's life." Lorraine's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Remove the damaged tissue? You mean amputate her legs?" Dr. Phillips leaned forward and nodded slowly. "Both legs would need to be removed below the knee. The damage above the knee is minimal, and we're confident we can save those portions of her limbs. With prosthetics, she could eventually walk again. She could have a full, productive life." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But she would not have the life she planned. Her athletic career, her dreams of competing at the collegiate level, of potentially reaching the Olympics, those dreams would be over. Reverend Whitfield reached out and took Lorraine's hand as tears began streaming down her face. Rhonda wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders, holding her up as the weight of the decision threatened to crush her completely. For a long moment, no one in that conference room spoke. The only sound was Lorraine's quiet sobbing, the sound of a mother's heart breaking into pieces too small to ever fully reassemble. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "If I don't sign the consent forms, she dies. Is that what you're telling me?" Dr. Brennan met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am. That is what I'm telling you." She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer that only she and God could hear. Then she opened her eyes, picked up the pen Dr. Phillips had placed on the table, and signed her name on the consent forms at 4:47 p.m. on March 17, 2018. Her signature was barely legible, her hands shaking so violently that the letters looked more like seismograph readings than handwriting. Before they wheeled Destiny into surgery, Lorraine asked to see her one more time. She stood beside the hospital bed and memorized every detail of her daughter's face, still swollen from the allergic reaction, but still beautiful, still her baby girl. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though Destiny couldn't hear her. "I'm so sorry. I love you. Fight for me, baby. Please fight." Then she stepped back and watched them wheel her daughter through the double doors toward the operating room, not knowing if she would ever see her alive again. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. On March 19, 2018, 2 days after surgeons removed both of her legs below the knee, Destiny opened her eyes for the first time since collapsing in that hallway. The fluorescent lights of the ICU seemed impossibly bright after days of unconsciousness, and she squinted against the glare, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar shapes and sounds surrounding her. The first thing she became aware of was pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from somewhere below her waist. The second thing she became aware of was her mother's face, hovering above her with an expression that mixed profound relief with something else, something that looked almost like grief. Lorraine was smiling, but tears were streaming down her cheeks in rivers that she made no effort to wipe away. "You're okay, baby," she said, her voice cracking on every syllable. "You're going to be okay." Destiny tried to speak, but her throat was raw from the breathing tube that had been removed only hours earlier. She tried to move, to shift her position in the uncomfortable hospital bed, and that was when she realized something was terribly wrong. She couldn't feel her legs, not the numbness of a limb that had fallen asleep, but a complete absence of sensation, as if the lower half of her body had simply ceased to exist. She looked at her mother with growing panic in her eyes, silently begging for an explanation that she already knew she didn't want to hear. Lorraine took a deep breath, steadying herself for the conversation she had been dreading since signing those consent forms 2 days earlier. There was no easy way to say what needed to be said, no words that could soften the blow of what her daughter was about to learn. "Baby, there was an incident at school," Lorraine began, choosing her words carefully. "Someone put peanuts in your locker. You had a severe allergic reaction, and your heart stopped. The doctors saved your life, but—" She paused, tears flowing freely now, her voice dissolving into sobs she could no longer contain. "The damage to your legs was too severe. They had to remove them to save you. Below the knee. Both of them." For a moment, Destiny simply stared at her mother, her brain refusing to process the information it had just received. Then she reached down toward where her legs should have been, her hands finding only bandages and empty space beneath the hospital blanket. The scream that tore from her throat was not a sound Lorraine would ever forget, no matter how many years passed or how much therapy she sought. It was the sound of a dream dying, of a future being ripped away, of a 17-year-old girl confronting a reality too cruel to comprehend. She screamed until her voice gave out completely, until the nurses came rushing in with sedatives that her mother waved away. Lorraine didn't want her daughter drugged into oblivion. She wanted to be there for her, to hold her through this impossible moment, even though she knew that nothing she could say or do would make it better. When the screaming finally stopped, Destiny turned her face toward the wall and refused to speak. She didn't say a word for 3 days. She didn't look at her mother or the nurses or the doctors who came to check on her recovery. She didn't look at the places where her legs had been, asking only that they be covered with blankets so she wouldn't have to see the evidence of what had been taken from her. Hospital psychologists evaluated her twice during those silent days, diagnosing acute trauma and depression that would require extensive treatment. When she finally did speak, her first questions broke Lorraine's heart all over again. "Can I still go to Stanford?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Will I ever run again?" Lorraine couldn't answer either question honestly, so she simply held her daughter and cried. Meanwhile, outside those hospital walls, an investigation was beginning that would take 18 months to produce justice. Thank you for your incredible support in watching this far. This channel thrives because of viewers like you who care about these stories. Consider joining our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, access premium content, and help us keep bringing you the stories that matter. Your support makes all the difference. Now, let's continue with what happened next. While Destiny lay in a hospital bed trying to comprehend a future without her legs, the machinery of justice began to turn at Jefferson Ridge. Principal Eleanor Whitmore had sealed Locker 247 as potential evidence within hours of the ambulance leaving her campus, and she had personally pulled security footage from every camera in the sophomore hallway. She knew in her gut that this was no accident. Peanuts don't appear in lockers by coincidence, especially not in the locker of a girl whose severe allergy was documented in official school records. Someone had done this deliberately, and the principal was determined to find out who. On March 15, 2018, the day after the attack, she placed a call to the Ridgewood Police Department and requested that a detective be assigned to investigate what she believed was attempted murder. The case landed on the desk of Detective Ronald Baker, a 22-year veteran of the department who had investigated everything from domestic disputes to drug trafficking to cold-blooded homicide. But in all his years carrying a badge, he had never encountered a case quite like this one. A teenage girl had been nearly killed using peanuts as a weapon, her documented allergy exploited with what appeared to be calculated precision. The method was almost untraceable. There were no fingerprints on a murder weapon because the weapon was food. There was no DNA evidence because peanuts don't carry genetic markers that point to a specific perpetrator. Whoever had done this had chosen their method carefully, and Detective Baker knew from the moment he opened the case file that proving guilt would be an uphill battle. He arrived at the school on March 15th with a forensics team and began processing Locker 247 as a crime scene. They found traces of peanut residue throughout the interior, concentrated near the bottom where the nuts had been placed. They found partial fingerprints on the locker door, dozens of them, but most were smudged or degraded beyond the point of useful identification. Lockers are touched by multiple people throughout a school year, and separating relevant prints from background noise would prove nearly impossible. Detective Baker photographed everything, documented everything, and collected samples that would be sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Then he turned his attention to the security footage that Principal Whitmore had preserved. The footage showed the sophomore hallway from 7 a.m. to noon on March 14, 2018. At 7:22 a.m., a figure appeared on camera walking toward Locker 247. The figure was wearing a cheerleading jacket, the distinctive red and white design unmistakable even in the grainy footage. The figure approached the locker, entered what appeared to be a combination, opened the door, and placed something inside. The figure then closed the locker and walked away quickly, head down, avoiding any angle that might capture a clear view of the face. Detective Baker watched the footage 17 times, pausing and rewinding and enhancing. But the camera angle was too oblique. The face was never clearly visible. The identity of the figure could not be definitively confirmed. Over the next 3 days, Detective Baker interviewed 23 students who might have witnessed something relevant. Most knew nothing useful, but several of them, unprompted and independently of each other, mentioned the same name, Brittany Thornton. They mentioned the rivalry that had intensified since the scholarship announcement. They mentioned the hatred that seemed to radiate from her whenever Destiny's name was mentioned. One student, a girl named Ashley Cooper, who ran in the same social circles as Brittany, admitted something that made the detective's blood run cold. She was asking about Destiny's allergy, Ashley said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to know how serious it was, like whether someone could actually die from it. Detective Baker had his suspect. He had motive, he had circumstantial evidence, and he had a figure on video that matched her description perfectly. But suspicion is not proof, and the Thornton family had resources that most suspects could only dream of. The real battle was just beginning. Principal Eleanor Whitmore had served Jefferson Ridge for 18 years, first as a teacher, then as assistant principal, and finally as the woman whose name appeared on every diploma handed to graduating seniors. She had weathered budget cuts and teacher strikes and the everyday dramas that come with managing a building full of teenagers. But nothing in her career had prepared her for the meeting that took place in her office on March 16, 2018, the day after police began their investigation. Gregory Thornton arrived at the school at 9:08 a.m. sharp, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the principal earned in a month. He was accompanied by a man named Richard Sullivan, a high-powered attorney whose reputation preceded him throughout the state of Georgia. They didn't ask to meet with her. They informed her secretary that they would be meeting with her, and they expected her to clear her schedule immediately. The meeting began with Gregory expressing what he called concern for all students involved in this unfortunate incident. He spoke as if his daughter were also a victim, as if the near death of Destiny Crawford were something that had happened to his family rather than something caused by them. He suggested that the whole situation was an unfortunate accident, that perhaps Destiny had been careless with her own allergy management, that perhaps the school itself bore responsibility for not having adequate emergency protocols in place. Principal Whitmore listened to these deflections with growing disgust, her hands clasped tightly on her desk to keep herself from saying something she might regret. When Gregory finally paused for breath, she responded with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Mr. Thornton, your daughter was seen on security camera approaching Destiny Crawford's locker on the morning of the attack. This was not an accident." His demeanor changed instantly. The mask of concerned parent fell away, replaced by the ruthless businessman who had built a $40 million empire on intimidation and manipulation. He demanded to see the security footage. He demanded to know exactly what evidence the school had collected. He threatened to sue the district for defamation if his daughter's name was released to the media or connected publicly to the investigation. Richard Sullivan sat beside him taking notes, occasionally interjecting legal threats that were clearly designed to frighten the principal into compliance. But Eleanor Whitmore had not built her career by being easily frightened. She met Gregory's gaze without flinching and refused every demand. Then came the offer that would later be documented in her personal notes, evidence of obstruction that prosecutors would reference during trial. Gregory leaned forward in his chair and spoke in a voice that was almost friendly, almost reasonable. He offered to make a substantial donation to the school, enough to fund a new athletic facility that would bear the school's name. He offered to personally cover all of Destiny's medical expenses, every surgery and hospital bill and rehabilitation cost. The conditions were never explicitly stated, but they hung in the air between them like poison gas. Make this investigation go away. Principal Whitmore rose from her chair, her body trembling with barely contained rage. "A girl is fighting for her life," she said, her voice steady despite her fury. "She may never walk again, and you're sitting here worried about saving your daughter's reputation." Gregory's response was chilling in its casual cruelty. "I'm worried about protecting my family, Principal Whitmore. You should worry about protecting yours." The threat was unmistakable. She understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, a man who would destroy anyone who stood in his way. But she also understood something else. She could not live with herself if she let this go. After Gregory and his attorney left her office, she picked up her phone and called Detective Baker. "I have something you need to see," she told him. "And I have a lot to tell you about the man who just tried to bribe me into silence." The battle lines had been drawn. The Thorntons had made their first move, and Principal Whitmore had made hers. On March 18, 2018, 4 days after the attack that nearly killed Destiny, Brittany Thornton was brought in for questioning at the Ridgewood Police Department. She was accompanied by Richard Sullivan, her father, and her mother Suzanne, who sat in the corner of the interview room looking like she wished she could disappear into the wallpaper. Detective Baker had conducted hundreds of interrogations throughout his career, and he prided himself on being able to read people, to detect the subtle tells that separated truth from lies. But the girl sitting across from him was unlike any suspect he had ever encountered. She showed no emotion whatsoever, no fear, no anxiety, no guilt. Her face was a perfect mask of polished indifference, as if being questioned about an attempted murder was merely an inconvenience in her otherwise perfect life. She denied everything with mechanical precision. She denied placing anything in Destiny's locker. She denied knowing anything about the peanuts found inside. She denied harboring any ill will toward Destiny, despite multiple witnesses who had testified to the contrary. "I barely knew her," she said with a dismissive shrug. We had different friends, different classes. I had no reason to hurt her. When Detective Baker mentioned the security footage showing a figure in a cheerleading jacket approaching locker 247, she didn't miss a beat. Half the girls in this school have cheerleading jackets. That video could be anyone. Her answers were rehearsed, her delivery flawless. Too flawless. Detective Baker recognized the performance for what it was. Professional coaching from someone who understood how interrogations worked and how to beat them. Evidence would later reveal the extent of Gregory's involvement in preparing his daughter for this moment. In the 3 days between the attack and the interrogation, he had hired a crisis management consultant who specialized in coaching clients through legal difficulties. He had rehearsed her answers until she could deliver them in her sleep. He had taught her how to sit, how to position her hands, how to maintain eye contact without appearing aggressive, how to modulate her voice to convey just the right amount of confusion and concern. Gregory had transformed his teenage daughter into a professional witness, and Detective Baker knew it. But knowing something and proving it in court were very different things. Richard Sullivan wasted no time launching a counteroffensive against the investigation. He filed a motion to suppress the security footage, arguing that it was too inconclusive to be relevant and too prejudicial to be shown in any potential court proceeding. He argued that releasing the footage would constitute defamation against a minor who had not been charged with any crime. He argued that the school had violated his client's privacy rights by preserving and sharing the footage without her consent. The motion was ultimately denied by a judge who saw through the legal maneuvering, but it bought valuable time, and time was what the Thorntons needed to wage their campaign of disinformation. Over the following weeks, the family launched a coordinated assault on the Crawford family's credibility. Rumors began circulating through Ridgewood that Destiny had exposed herself deliberately, seeking attention or perhaps laying the groundwork for a lawsuit. Other rumors suggested that Lorraine was a gold digger, that she had seen an opportunity to extract money from a wealthy family, and was pursuing false accusations for financial gain. These whispers spread through church congregations and PTA meetings and social media groups, poisoning the well of public opinion against a family that was already struggling to survive. Some people believed the lies. The community that should have rallied around Destiny was instead divided into warring camps. And while strangers debated whether she deserved sympathy, Destiny lay in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling, trying to imagine a future that no longer included the legs she had lost. For 2 weeks, Lorraine Crawford had been a model of strength and composure, sitting at her daughter's bedside while the world crumbled around her. She had held Destiny's hand through the worst moments of her young life. She had listened to doctors explain in clinical terms how her daughter's future had been stolen. She had fielded phone calls from relatives and reporters and attorneys, all while running on nothing but coffee, prayer, and the fierce determination that had carried her through every hardship life had thrown at her. But even the strongest walls eventually crack under enough pressure, and on March 28, 2018, Lorraine reached the absolute limit of what any human being could be expected to endure. She had heard the rumors circulating through Ridgewood, the whispers suggesting that her daughter had somehow brought this tragedy upon herself, that Lorraine was exploiting the situation for financial gain. She had seen the social media posts questioning whether Brittany was really responsible, suggesting that the Crawfords were targeting an innocent girl from a wealthy family out of jealousy and greed. Each lie felt like a knife in her heart, twisting deeper every time she heard a new variation. But the breaking point came when a co-worker at the factory mentioned, almost casually, that Gregory Thornton had been telling people that Destiny should be grateful she survived, that the Crawford family should consider themselves lucky and move on, that some people simply weren't meant to succeed, no matter how many scholarships they received. At 6:45 p.m. on March 28th, Lorraine drove to the Thornton residence on the west side of Ridgewood. The house was a mansion by any reasonable standard, set back from the road behind iron gates that announced to the world that the people inside were different from ordinary citizens. She parked outside those gates and waited, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, her heart pounding with rage that had been building for 2 weeks. When Gregory's Mercedes pulled into the driveway and he stepped out of the car, Lorraine was already walking toward him. She grabbed him by the collar of his expensive shirt, her fingers twisting in the fabric as tears streamed down her face. "You've ruined my daughter's future," she screamed, her voice echoing off the manicured lawns of the wealthy neighborhood. "You've destroyed her life." Gregory looked at this woman, this grieving mother whose daughter lay mutilated because of his daughter's actions, and he felt nothing but contempt. He pried her hands from his shirt and stepped backward, straightening his collar with exaggerated dignity. Then he spoke words that would be repeated in court, words that revealed exactly what kind of man he was beneath the expensive suits and charitable donations. "Get your hands off me," he said coldly. "You're acting like an animal." He paused, letting the words land like blows. "Like a dog." Lorraine stood frozen, unable to process the cruelty of what she was hearing, but Gregory wasn't finished. "Your daughter should be grateful she survived," he continued. "Even without her legs, poverty doesn't change. People like you will always be at the bottom. A scholarship wasn't going to fix that. Nothing will." Lorraine slapped him across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. He immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice calm and controlled as he reported an assault in progress. Police arrived at 7:12 p.m. and found Lorraine standing on the sidewalk, sobbing uncontrollably while Gregory held an ice pack to his reddened cheek with theatrical victimhood. She was arrested for assault, handcuffed in front of the mansion, while he watched with satisfaction. Suzanne observed the scene from an upstairs window, saying nothing, doing nothing. Lorraine spent 6 hours in a holding cell before relatives could scrape together enough money for bail. She was later sentenced to 12 months probation, ordered to stay 500 feet from the Thorntons, and required to attend anger management classes. The woman whose daughter had been mutilated was now a criminal. The man who called her a dog, who mocked her daughter's amputated legs, walked free. And somewhere in that sprawling mansion, Brittany prepared for bed as if nothing had happened. By April 2018, Detective Ronald Baker found himself trapped in the most frustrating investigation of his entire career. He had a suspect he was certain was guilty. He had motive established through multiple witness testimonies. He had circumstantial evidence that pointed directly at Brittany like an accusatory finger. But certainty and evidence are not the same thing, and the evidence he had collected was simply not enough to secure a conviction. The security footage remained his strongest piece of physical proof, but it had been captured from an angle that never showed the perpetrator's face. Defense attorneys would tear it apart on the witness stand, arguing that the figure could be any student wearing a cheerleading jacket, and they would be right. The footage proved someone approached locker 247, but it did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt who that someone was. The fingerprint analysis came back from the state crime lab with results that were equally disappointing. Dozens of prints had been lifted from the locker door and surrounding surfaces, but most belonged to Destiny herself, or were too smudged and degraded to match against any known individual. Brittany's fingerprints were on file from a volunteer program she had participated in 2 years earlier, but the forensic comparison was deemed insufficient for positive identification. The prints that might have belonged to her were partials, fragments that shared some characteristics with her known prints but fell short of the 12-point match required for courtroom certainty. Another dead end in a case that seemed designed to frustrate justice at every turn. The witness testimony that Detective Baker had gathered was damning in its implications, but problematic in its admissibility. Ashley Cooper's statement about Brittany asking questions regarding Destiny's allergy proved curiosity, not intent. The friends who described her hatred and jealousy provided motive, but motive alone doesn't send anyone to prison. Teachers who testified about behavioral changes after the scholarship announcement painted a picture of a girl consumed by resentment, but portraits aren't evidence. Every piece of the puzzle pointed toward guilt, but none of them locked together tightly enough to build a prosecutable case. Defense attorneys would create reasonable doubt in minutes, and Gregory had already demonstrated that he would hire the best attorneys money could buy. In May 2018, District Attorney Margaret Collins reviewed the case file that Detective Baker had assembled and delivered a verdict that felt like a punch to the gut. "There's not enough here," she told him, her voice heavy with genuine regret. "The footage is inconclusive. The fingerprints are insufficient. The witnesses are circumstantial at best. If we take this to trial, we lose. And if we lose, double jeopardy attaches. We can never try her again, no matter what evidence emerges in the future. She recommended waiting, keeping the case open, hoping that new evidence might surface or that witnesses might come forward with information they had been too afraid to share initially. Perhaps Brittany herself would confess, overcome by guilt, or caught bragging to the wrong person. None of those scenarios seemed likely, but they were all Detective Baker had left. The case officially stalled, suspended in bureaucratic limbo while Destiny learned to navigate the world from a wheelchair. The investigation remained technically open, but no new leads emerged, no new witnesses appeared, and no new evidence materialized to revive the pursuit of justice. Brittany returned to her life at Jefferson Ridge as if nothing had happened, protected by her father's money and her attorney's maneuvers. She walked the same hallways where Destiny had collapsed, attended the same classes, competed in the same athletic events. She even ran in the state championships that spring, winning a bronze medal in the 400 meters. No one mentioned that the girl who would have beaten her was lying in a rehabilitation facility, learning how to use a wheelchair because she no longer had legs. The Thorntons had won, or so they believed. In the months following the stalled investigation, the Thornton family settled back into their privileged existence with remarkable ease. For them, the near murder of Destiny Crawford became nothing more than an unpleasant chapter that had been successfully closed, a crisis that had been managed and overcome through the application of money, lawyers, and strategic public relations. Gregory interpreted the prosecutor's decision not to file charges as complete vindication, proof that his daughter had been unfairly targeted by jealous people who resented their family's success. He began attending school board meetings, not to express gratitude for the district's handling of the situation, but to demand apologies for what he called the persecution of an innocent teenage girl. Brittany returned to Jefferson Ridge within days of her police interrogation, walking through the front doors with her head held high as if daring anyone to challenge her right to be there. She resumed her position as co-captain of the cheerleading squad. She continued her training with the track team. She attended classes and submitted assignments and socialized with friends who had learned not to mention certain subjects in her presence. The girl who had nearly killed a classmate with calculated deliberation went about her junior year as if nothing had happened, shielded from consequence by a system that bent to accommodate wealth and power. Principal Whitmore watched this return to normalcy with barely concealed fury, but her hands were tied. Without criminal charges, Brittany remained a student in good standing, and treating her differently would expose the school to the very lawsuits Gregory had been threatening. The social dynamics at Jefferson Ridge shifted in ways that reflected the larger divisions in Ridgewood itself. Wealthy students from the West Side rallied around Brittany, accepting her father's narrative that she had been falsely accused by people who wanted to bring down a successful family. Working-class students from the East Side knew the truth, or at least suspected it, but they had seen what happened to those who challenged the Thorntons. Ashley Cooper, the girl who had told police about Brittany's questions regarding Destiny's allergy, found herself suddenly ostracized from her social circle. Other students who had provided statements to investigators noticed that their college recommendation letters were being mysteriously delayed, their academic records subjected to unusual scrutiny. The message was clear. Supporting the Crawfords came with a price that few were willing to pay. Gregory embarked on what could only be described as a victory tour through Ridgewood society. He gave an interview to the local newspaper in which he described his daughter as devastated by the false accusations that had been leveled against her, painting Brittany as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of violence. He never mentioned Destiny by name. He never acknowledged her injuries or expressed the slightest sympathy for what she had endured. In Gregory's version of events, the real tragedy was the stress his family had experienced during the investigation, the sleepless nights and legal fees, and damage to their reputation. The girl who had lost her legs barely registered as a footnote in his narrative of injustice. Meanwhile, local churches held prayer vigils for Destiny, their congregations lighting candles and asking God to deliver the justice that the legal system had failed to provide. Community organizations raised money to help with medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. Teachers who had watched her grow from a promising freshman into a record-breaking athlete grieved privately for the future she had lost. But prayers don't produce evidence, and grief doesn't generate arrest warrants. Without proof that would hold up in court, there was nothing anyone could do to hold Brittany accountable for what she had done. The community that should have been united in demanding justice was instead fractured along lines of class and privilege, exactly as Gregory had intended. While the Thorntons celebrated their escape from accountability, Destiny began the longest and most difficult journey of her young life. She was discharged from the hospital on April 22, 2018, 5 weeks after collapsing in that hallway. She had undergone 3 surgeries, spent countless hours in intensive care, and begun the preliminary stages of physical therapy. But leaving the hospital was not the end of her medical ordeal. It was barely the beginning. The girl who had once broken records on the track now had to learn how to navigate her own home in a wheelchair, how to transfer from bed to chair without assistance, how to dress and bathe and perform the basic functions of daily life that most people take for granted. For the next 6 months, she attended rehabilitation 3 times per week at a specialized facility in Atlanta. Her physical therapist was a woman named Carol Henderson, a no-nonsense professional who had worked with amputees for 15 years and had no patience for self-pity or excuses. Carol pushed Destiny harder than anyone had ever pushed her, refusing to accept limitations that she tried to impose on herself. When Destiny said she couldn't do something, Carol made her try anyway. When she cried from frustration and pain, Carol handed her tissues and told her to keep going. "You're not done," Carol said during one particularly brutal session when Destiny wanted nothing more than to give up. "You're not broken. You're rebuilding. And rebuilding takes time and sweat and tears, but you will get through this." In September 2018, 6 months after the attack, Destiny was fitted for her first prosthetic legs. The process was far more complicated than she had imagined, involving detailed measurements, multiple castings, and adjustments that seemed to take forever. The initial fitting was painful in ways she hadn't anticipated, the prosthetics pressing against nerve endings that were still hypersensitive from surgery. Learning to walk on artificial legs was nothing like learning to walk as a toddler, when muscles and bones grew together in natural harmony. This was mechanical, deliberate, exhausting work that required her to think about every single step. She fell 17 times during her first week of training. She developed blisters that became infected and required antibiotics. She developed doubts that Carol Henderson refused to let her indulge. By December 2018, she could walk short distances using a cane for support. By March 2019, a full year after the attack, she could walk unassisted for 20 minutes at a time. It wasn't running. It would never be running again. But it was mobility. It was independence. It was proof that Brittany had not taken everything from her. The psychological wounds, however, were slower to heal than the physical ones. Destiny experienced nightmares about the attack that left her screaming in her sleep. She experienced panic attacks triggered by the smell of peanuts, her body remembering the trauma even when her conscious mind tried to move forward. She experienced depression so profound that some days she couldn't find a reason to get out of bed. She attended therapy twice weekly for 18 months, working with a trauma specialist named Dr. Vanessa Cole, who helped her process the anger and grief and fear that threatened to consume her. Dr. Cole taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it didn't matter. Healing was about finding a way to move forward despite the pain, to build a new life that acknowledged the trauma without being defined by it. "You can't change what was done to you," Dr. Cole told her during one session, "but you can choose what you do with the rest of your life. That choice belongs to you and no one else." Destiny held on to those words like a lifeline during the darkest moments of her recovery, when justice seemed impossible and the future seemed like nothing but endless struggle. She couldn't know that 18 months after the attack, everything would change. September 14, 2019, marked exactly 18 months since Destiny collapsed in that hallway. The investigation into her attack had long since gone cold, the case file gathering dust in a cabinet at the police department while Detective Baker pursued other crimes with evidence that could actually lead to convictions. Brittany had graduated from Jefferson Ridge and been accepted to 3 universities, her future seemingly secure despite the darkness in her past. The Crawford family had learned to live with the absence of justice, focusing their energy on Destiny's recovery and her upcoming enrollment at Stanford. The world had moved on, as the world always does, leaving the victims to carry their burdens alone. Then, At 7:23 p.m. on that September evening, Principal Whitmore received an email that would shatter the carefully constructed peace the Thorntons had built around themselves. The subject line was simple and direct. "I have something you need to see." The sender was anonymous, using a burner email address that investigators would later trace to a public library computer, but would never connect to any specific individual. The principal almost deleted the message as spam, her finger hovering over the button that would have sent it to digital oblivion. Something made her hesitate. Something made her click on the attachment instead. The video file was approximately 45 seconds long, and it showed the sophomore hallway on the morning of March 14, 2018. But this was not the grainy, oblique security footage that had frustrated investigators for 18 months. This was high-definition video, crystal clear, captured at eye level rather than from a ceiling-mounted camera. The footage had been recorded on a student's smartphone, part of a selfie video that a sophomore named Jonathan Wells had been filming for his social media accounts. Jonathan had been recording himself walking through the hallway, practicing a comedic bit he planned to post online, completely unaware of the crime taking place in the background of his frame. But there it was, unmistakable and undeniable. In the background of Jonathan's video, clearly visible over his left shoulder, was Brittany Thornton. She was standing in front of locker 247, holding a small plastic bag in her hand. The video captured her opening the locker door, pouring the contents of the bag inside, and closing the door with a satisfied smile on her face. Her face was clearly visible. Her actions were clearly deliberate. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation, no reasonable doubt that a defense attorney could manufacture. This was proof. This was the evidence that had eluded investigators for 18 months, hiding in plain sight on a teenager's phone. Jonathan had not realized what he had captured until months after the attack, when he was reviewing old videos and noticed something strange in the background of one of his recordings. He had been terrified of the Thornton family, terrified of the retaliation they might unleash if he came forward, terrified of becoming a target himself. For over a year, he had kept the video secret, wrestling with his conscience while Brittany walked free. But conscience has a way of winning in the end, and Jonathan finally decided that he could not live with himself if he stayed silent any longer. He sent the video anonymously, hoping that someone braver than himself would do what needed to be done. Principal Whitmore watched the video 3 times, her heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and fury. Then she picked up her phone and called Detective Baker. "I have new evidence," she told him, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Clear evidence. You need to see this tonight." The detective arrived at her home within the hour, watched the video himself, and immediately understood that everything had changed. He pulled out his phone and made a call of his own. "We've got her," he said. The morning of September 17, 2019, began like any other Tuesday in the Thornton household. Gregory was preparing for a meeting with potential investors in a new development project. Suzanne was scheduling her charity board obligations for the coming week. And Brittany, now 18 years old and legally an adult, was eating breakfast in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone and making plans with college friends. She had spent the past 18 months believing she had gotten away with attempted murder, that her father's money and lawyers had successfully buried the truth forever. She had applied to universities, written essays about overcoming adversity, and positioned herself as a young woman with a bright future ahead. She had no idea that her future was about to collapse in on itself. At 7:15 a.m., 3 police vehicles turned onto the private road leading to the Thornton estate. Detective Baker sat in the lead car, a warrant signed by Judge Thomas Fitzgerald resting on the seat beside him. The charges listed on that warrant were severe. Aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. Not a juvenile matter to be handled with sealed records and rehabilitation programs. Adult charges that carried adult consequences, including the possibility of 20 years in state prison. The detective had waited 18 months for this moment, watching helplessly as Brittany lived her life without consequence, while Destiny learned to walk on prosthetic legs. The wait was finally over. Gregory emerged from the front door before the police cars had even come to a complete stop, his face already contorted with rage. "This is harassment," he shouted as Detective Baker stepped out of his vehicle. "This is persecution. You'll hear from my lawyers within the hour." The detective said nothing. He simply handed Gregory the warrant and walked past him into the house. Brittany was still sitting at the kitchen island when the officers entered, a spoonful of cereal frozen halfway to her mouth. She looked at the uniformed men filing into her home with an expression of confusion that slowly transformed into something else. Recognition. Understanding. Fear. "Brittany Elizabeth Thornton," Detective Baker said, the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind finally given voice. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Her composure cracked for the first time since the investigation began. Her eyes darted to her father, seeking the protection that had always been there before. But Gregory couldn't protect her now. The new video evidence had changed everything, and even his army of lawyers couldn't make it disappear. She was handcuffed in her own kitchen, the metal restraints clicking shut around wrists that had never known hardship or consequence. Suzanne stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter being led away like a common criminal. For 20 years, she had perfected the art of not seeing what she didn't want to see. Now she was being forced to watch as the consequences of that willful blindness played out in real time. Gregory was still shouting about lawsuits and wrongful arrest, but his words had lost their power. The evidence was too strong. The victim was too sympathetic. The truth could no longer be buried under money and intimidation. Brittany was placed in the back of a police cruiser, her face blank and pale through the window, as the vehicle pulled away from the mansion that had sheltered her for her entire privileged life. News of the arrest spread through Ridgewood within hours. Local television stations interrupted their morning programming with breaking news bulletins. National outlets picked up the story by noon, drawn to the dramatic elements of wealth, privilege, and attempted murder. "Wealthy teen arrested in peanut attack that cost. Classmate her legs," the headline screamed. 18 months of frustration had finally found an outlet. She was no longer untouchable. And the real reckoning was just beginning. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by the discovery of Jonathan Wells' video, began turning with a momentum that the Thornton family could no longer control. District Attorney Margaret Collins, the same prosecutor who had reluctantly declined to file charges 18 months earlier, now found herself with a case that was almost unlosable. The new evidence was devastating. Clear, high-definition footage of Brittany committing the act that had nearly killed Destiny and cost her both legs. The motive had been established through extensive witness testimony gathered during the original investigation. The medical records documenting the injuries were meticulous and horrifying in their detail. This was no longer a case built on circumstantial evidence and unclear security footage. This was a prosecution with teeth. Richard Sullivan, the high-powered attorney who had protected the family throughout the initial investigation, immediately went on the offensive. He filed motion after motion in an attempt to suppress the new video evidence, arguing that it had been obtained through questionable means, that the chain of custody was compromised, that Jonathan Wells had violated his client's privacy by recording without her consent. Judge Thomas Fitzgerald denied every motion. Sullivan then attempted to argue that she should be tried as a juvenile, since she had been 17 at the time of the crime. This argument was rejected with particular force. At 17 years old, Judge Fitzgerald wrote in his ruling, the defendant was old enough to research the lethality of peanut allergies, old enough to plan an attack, and old enough to execute that plan with calculated precision. She will be tried as an adult. The defense strategy shifted to damage control. Sullivan acknowledged during preliminary hearings that Brittany had placed peanuts in Destiny's locker, but he argued that she never intended to cause serious harm. She wanted to scare her, Sullivan told the court, previewing an argument that would form the centerpiece of the defense. She was a teenager acting impulsively, out of jealousy and wounded pride. She made a terrible mistake, but she is not a murderer. She did not intend for Destiny Crawford to lose her legs. Prosecutors responded with evidence of her internet searches in the weeks before the attack, showing that she had researched the severity of peanut allergies and the potentially fatal consequences of anaphylactic shock. This was not impulse. This was premeditation. The bail hearing became a battleground. Prosecutors argued that she posed a flight risk given her family's substantial resources and international connections. Sullivan countered that she had deep roots in the community and no prior criminal record. Judge Fitzgerald set bail at $750,000, a sum that Gregory paid within hours of the hearing's conclusion. Brittany was released to house arrest pending trial, fitted with an ankle monitor that tracked her every movement. She was forbidden from attending school, from leaving her home except for legal appointments, from having any contact with the Crawfords or witnesses in the case. The isolation she had intended for Destiny had become her own reality. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for a legal battle that would captivate the nation. Margaret Collins assembled a team of prosecutors who worked around the clock reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and constructing a narrative that would leave no doubt in the minds of the jurors. Richard Sullivan hired jury consultants and expert witnesses, searching for any angle that might save his client from the consequences of her actions. Gregory reportedly spent over $2 million on legal fees in the months before trial, a staggering sum that reflected his desperation to protect his daughter from the prison sentence she so richly deserved. The charges were finalized in November 2019. Aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury, a first-degree felony, carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in state prison. Brittany's life, once seemingly destined for Ivy League success and country club privilege, now hung in the balance of a courtroom scale. And on the other side of that scale sat a young woman in a wheelchair, waiting for justice. The trial began on January 13, 2020, in the Ridgewood County Courthouse, a century-old building whose granite columns had witnessed countless legal dramas, but few as emotionally charged as the one about to unfold. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity every day of the proceedings, with spectators lined up outside before dawn, hoping to secure one of the limited public seats. Media organizations from across the country sent reporters to cover what had become a national story about privilege, jealousy, and attempted murder in small-town Georgia. Security was heightened after threats were received against both families, metal detectors installed at every entrance, deputies stationed at every door. Lorraine sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table, every single day of the trial. Beside her sat Destiny, sometimes in her wheelchair, sometimes standing on the prosthetic legs she had worked so hard to master. Their presence was a constant reminder to the jury of what this case was really about. Not legal technicalities or youthful mistakes, but a young woman whose legs had been taken from her by someone who believed the rules didn't apply to wealthy people. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat Gregory and Suzanne, their faces carefully composed masks of concern and confidence. The physical divide between the two families mirrored the chasm of class and circumstance that had led to this moment. District Attorney Collins delivered an opening statement that laid out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. She described the defendant as a young woman consumed by jealousy, raised to believe that losing was unacceptable, driven to violence when a girl from the wrong side of town dared to outshine her. She walked the jury through the evidence, the motive established by the scholarship announcement, the research into peanut allergies, the video showing her placing the weapon in Destiny's locker. She showed photographs of Destiny in the hospital, her body swollen and broken, tubes emerging from every opening. She showed photographs of the amputation sites, the stark reality of what jealousy had cost. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes before the first witness was even called. The testimony that followed over the next 2 weeks painted a comprehensive picture of premeditated cruelty. Jonathan Wells took the stand and explained how he had unknowingly captured the crime on his phone, his voice trembling as he recounted the guilt that had eaten at him for 18 months. Ashley Cooper testified about the obsessive questions regarding Destiny's allergy, her obvious discomfort suggesting she knew exactly how damning her words were. Teachers described the dramatic behavioral changes after the scholarship announcement. Dr. Brennan delivered clinical testimony about the medical consequences of anaphylaxis, explaining in graphic detail how Destiny's legs had died cell by cell while she fought for her life. Then Brittany took the stand, Against Richard Sullivan's advice, she insisted on testifying in her own defense, apparently believing that her practiced composure would play well with the jury. She admitted to placing the peanuts in Destiny's locker, a confession that drew gasps from the gallery, but she maintained that she never intended to cause serious harm. "I just wanted to scare her," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey remorse. "I wanted her to know she wasn't untouchable." D.A. Collins approached the witness stand for cross-examination, her eyes locked on the defendants with the intensity of a predator sensing weakness. "Miss Thornton, you researched peanut allergies before the attack, correct?" She nodded. "You learned that exposure could be fatal, correct?" Another nod. "But you claim you didn't think it would actually cause harm." She hesitated, and in that hesitation, the jury saw everything they needed to see. "I didn't think it would be this bad." Collins pressed harder. "But you knew it could be fatal, and you did it anyway?" Her composure finally cracked. "Yes," she whispered. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning their verdict: guilty of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury. Lorraine collapsed, sobbing in her daughter's arms as the verdict was read. Across the courtroom, Brittany stared straight ahead, showing no emotion at all. The sentencing hearing took place on February 28, 2020, in the same courtroom where the guilty verdict had been delivered 5 weeks earlier. Judge Fitzgerald presided over proceedings that would determine how much of her life Brittany would spend behind bars. Before announcing the sentence, he allowed victim impact statements from the Crawford family, an opportunity for Destiny and Lorraine to speak directly to the woman who had caused them so much pain. Destiny wheeled herself to the microphone, her prosthetic legs visible beneath her dress, and addressed the court in a voice that did not waver. "You tried to destroy me," she said, looking directly at her attacker. "But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And no matter what happens today, I will never let you define my future." Judge Fitzgerald then delivered a sentence that balanced justice with the reality that the defendant, despite her crimes, was still a young woman with decades of life ahead of her. 12 years in state prison, no possibility of parole for 8 years. 5 years of supervised probation upon release, a lifetime restraining order protecting the Crawford family. "This was not a prank gone wrong," Judge Fitzgerald said, his voice heavy with the weight of the judgment he was rendering. "This was cruelty, disguised as competition, entitlement taken to its most dangerous extreme. A young woman lost her legs because you could not accept that someone you considered beneath you had outshined you. That kind of cruelty demands serious consequences." Brittany was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning a journey to the Georgia Women's Correctional Facility that would consume the next phase of her life. The conviction and sentencing triggered a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the defendant herself. Gregory's business empire, already strained by millions in legal fees, began to crumble as clients and partners distanced themselves from the family name. Real estate deals that had been in negotiation for months suddenly fell through. Business partners who had overlooked his ruthless tactics for years found their consciences catching up with them. Within 18 months of the verdict, Thornton Development Corporation had lost over 60% of its value, and Gregory was facing the very real possibility of bankruptcy. The marriage that had survived affairs and scandals and countless humiliations finally shattered under the weight of their daughter's imprisonment. Suzanne filed for divorce on June 3, 2020, citing irreconcilable differences in the legal paperwork, but telling friends the real reason. She blamed Gregory for everything. For raising their daughter to believe she was above consequences. For teaching her that winning was the only thing that mattered. For creating the conditions that had turned their child into a criminal. The divorce was finalized in 2021, with Suzanne receiving a settlement that allowed her to disappear to Arizona, where she lived quietly and never spoke to the media again. But karma, it seemed, was not finished with Gregory. On October 14, 2021, less than 2 years after his daughter's conviction, he was driving alone on Interstate 85 when his Mercedes crossed the median for reasons that were never determined. He collided head-on with a semi-truck traveling in the opposite direction. The truck driver walked away with minor injuries. Gregory was extracted from the wreckage by emergency responders, who initially believed he was dead. He wasn't dead. But in many ways, his life as he knew it ended on that highway. The accident severed his spinal cord at the C4 vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He could move only his head. He could not feed himself, dress himself, or perform any basic function without assistance. He would require 24-hour care for the rest of his days. The man who had called Lorraine a dog, who had mocked destiny for losing her legs, who had said she should be grateful to survive even without her legs, now understood with terrible intimacy what it meant to lose control of his own body. Some called it karma. Others called it coincidence. But no one who knew the story could ignore the symmetry of his fate, while the Thornton family disintegrated under the weight of consequence. Destiny began building the future that jealousy had tried so hard to destroy. In April 2020, just 2 months after the sentencing, Stanford University issued a statement that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who had followed her journey. Her scholarship remained intact. The offer that had been extended to a 17-year-old track star 2 years earlier was still valid for the 20-year-old woman who would arrive on campus in a wheelchair. Destiny Crawford earned this scholarship through her talent, her determination, and her character. The university's statement read, "Those qualities have not changed. We are honored to welcome her to the Stanford community." She enrolled at Stanford in September 2020, 3,000 miles from the town where her legs had been taken, 3,000 miles from the memories that haunted every corner of Ridgewood, Georgia. She chose to major in pre-law, a decision that surprised no one who knew her story. "I want to help people who can't help themselves," she told a reporter during her freshman year. "I want to make sure that money never again determines whether someone gets justice. I want to be the kind of lawyer who fights for the underdog, because I know what it feels like to be the underdog." Her professors quickly recognized the same exceptional qualities that had made her a star athlete: discipline, focus, determination, and an unwillingness to accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. During her junior year, she channeled her experience into advocacy work that extended far beyond her own story. She founded a nonprofit organization called Allergies Are Not Accidents, dedicated to raising awareness about the dangers of food allergies and advocating for better protections in schools and public spaces. The organization lobbied for legislation requiring comprehensive allergy training for school staff. It provided resources for families navigating the complex medical and legal landscape of life-threatening allergies. It connected survivors of allergy-related attacks with support networks and legal assistance. By 2024, the nonprofit had chapters in 15 states and had helped pass protective legislation in 7 of them. What had been done to her became a catalyst for protecting countless others from similar fates. The Olympic dream that had once defined her future had died in that hallway in 2018. She would never compete as a runner, never feel the wind against her face as she crossed a finish line, never stand on a podium with a medal around her neck. That loss was permanent and irreversible, a piece of herself that could never be restored no matter how successful she became in other areas of her life. But in 2024, 6 years after the attack that changed everything, she received an invitation that proved the universe sometimes offers unexpected forms of redemption. The organizing committee of the Summer Olympics invited her to speak at the opening ceremony, to share her story with billions of viewers around the world. She stood on that global stage, her prosthetic legs visible beneath her dress, and delivered a speech that brought audiences to tears across every continent. She spoke about resilience, about refusing to let tragedy define your future, about the power of human determination to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. She spoke about justice, both the kind delivered by courtrooms and the kind you create for yourself by living fully, despite what others have done to you. She spoke about forgiveness, not the kind that absolves those who harmed you, but the kind that frees you from the prison of endless bitterness. When she finished, the stadium erupted in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. She wasn't running, but she was standing before the entire world, proving that her attacker had failed to destroy her. The girl from the east side of Ridgewood, the girl who had helped raise her siblings while her mother worked double shifts, the girl who had lost her legs to jealousy and privilege, had become something far greater than an Olympic athlete. She had become a symbol of survival itself. As of 2024, 6 years after the attack that changed her life, Destiny Marie Crawford is completing her law degree at Stanford University. She graduates near the top of her class, with offers from several of the most prestigious law firms in the country fighting for the privilege of hiring her. She has decided to join a firm specializing in civil rights litigation, where she plans to spend her career fighting for people who have been denied justice by systems designed to protect the powerful. She remains close with her mother and siblings, flying home to Georgia several times a year to visit the family that supported her through the darkest chapters of her journey. She walks daily on prosthetic legs that she helped design in collaboration with an engineering firm, custom devices that reflect both cutting-edge technology and her own understanding of what an amputee needs to navigate the world. She still runs, though not competitively. Some mornings, before the campus wakes up, she jogs slowly along the paths near her apartment, her prosthetic legs carrying her forward one deliberate step at a time. She has said in interviews that every step feels like a victory, not over the person who hurt her, but over the despair that once threatened to consume her. She has moved past hatred, past bitterness, past the consuming desire for revenge that marked the early years of her recovery. She has chosen to define herself by what she has built rather than what was taken from her. It is, she says, the only way to truly survive. Lorraine retired from the textile factory in 2022, her body finally giving out after decades of punishing labor. The civil lawsuit against the Thornton family resulted in a settlement whose amount was never publicly disclosed, but it was enough for her to purchase a home for the first time in her life. She now spends her days supporting her daughter's advocacy work, traveling to conferences where she speaks about being the parent of a crime victim, sharing her story in hopes that it might help other families facing similar tragedies. She has never spoken to Gregory since that night outside his mansion, when he called her a dog and mocked her daughter's amputated legs. She has said she doesn't need to. Justice, in her view, has already been served. Brittany remains incarcerated at the Georgia Women's Correctional Facility, where she will be eligible for parole in 2028. Prison records indicate that she has completed several educational programs during her incarceration, earning credits toward a degree she will never use in the career she once imagined for herself. She has never publicly apologized to Destiny or her family, never expressed remorse for what she did, never acknowledged the full weight of the suffering she caused. Her mother, Suzanne, has visited her twice in 4 years, brief and uncomfortable encounters that reportedly ended with both women in tears. Her father cannot visit. He is confined to a care facility, unable to travel, unable to do anything for himself or anyone else. Gregory lives out his days in a long-term care facility in Atlanta, paralyzed from the neck down, dependent on nurses and aides for every basic function of existence. His fortune has been largely depleted by medical expenses, legal fees, and the divorce settlement paid to his ex-wife. He has given no interviews since his accident, made no public statements about his daughter or her crime, offered no reflections on the philosophy of life that led his family to ruin. He watches television most days, staring at a screen he cannot change, thinking thoughts he cannot share. One wonders if he ever thinks about Destiny, about the girl he dismissed as nothing, the girl who proved herself to be more than he could ever have imagined. Principal Whitmore retired from Jefferson Ridge in 2022, celebrated by colleagues and community members as a hero who refused to be intimidated by wealth and power. She received a commendation from the school board for her handling of the case, for preserving evidence when she could have destroyed it, for doing the right thing when the wrong thing would have been so much easier. She has said that Destiny Crawford taught her what true courage looks like. This story began with 2 girls in a high school hallway, their lives intersecting in ways that neither could have predicted. One had everything handed to her from the moment she was born: wealth, privilege, protection from consequence. The other had to earn everything she got, every achievement, every opportunity, every step toward a better life. One believed that success was about where you came from, that some people were simply born to win and others were born to serve as supporting characters in the winners' stories. The other believed that success was about where you were going, that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, that the circumstances of your birth did not have to determine the trajectory of your life. Both were right, in ways that neither could have imagined, and both paid prices for their beliefs that will follow them forever. What happened at Jefferson Ridge on March 14, 2018, was not inevitable. It was not fate or destiny or any cosmic force beyond human control. It was the result of choices made by individuals who could have chosen differently. Brittany chose to let jealousy consume her, to transform wounded pride into murderous rage, to use a classmate's medical vulnerability as a weapon. Gregory chose to raise his daughter to believe that some people mattered and others didn't, that rules existed only for those too weak to break them, that money could buy immunity from any consequence. The friends who knew something was being planned chose to stay silent, convincing themselves that surely nothing bad would really happen. The community chose to divide along lines of class and privilege, rather than unite behind a victim who deserved their support. Justice was delayed in this case. It was not denied. But it came at a cost that can never be fully calculated. Destiny lost her legs. She lost her Olympic dream. She lost her sense of safety in a world she had once navigated with confidence and hope. She gained wisdom, resilience, and a purpose that extends far beyond what she might have achieved as an athlete. But no one would choose the path she was forced to walk. No amount of success can fully compensate for what was stolen from her in that hallway. Brittany lost her freedom, her future, her place in the world she was raised to dominate. Her father lost his health, his wealth, his family, everything he thought defined him as a man. Whether this constitutes justice or merely consequence is a question that philosophers have debated for millennia. Perhaps there is no meaningful difference between the two. The lesson of this story is not that karma punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. The world is far too complicated for such neat moral equations. The lesson is that choices matter, that the values we teach our children shape the adults they become, that privilege without accountability produces monsters. Gregory raised his daughter to believe she was above other people, and she acted on that belief with horrifying results. The cheerleaders who knew something was wrong said nothing, and their silence enabled tragedy. The systems designed to protect all students failed destiny, because wealth creates exceptions that poverty cannot afford. These failures were not inevitable, they were chosen. And they can be unchosen by communities willing to demand better. On a spring morning in California, a young woman walks across a university campus. Her gait is different from those around her, each step deliberate and earned, powered by prosthetic legs and an indomitable will. She is carrying books, heading to class, building a future that was supposed to be impossible. Behind her, somewhere in Georgia, another young woman sits in a prison cell. Behind her, somewhere in Atlanta, a man lies in a bed he cannot leave. But she is not thinking about them. She is thinking about the cases she will argue, the people she will help, the justice she will fight to deliver. Destiny Crawford was supposed to be a runner. Instead, she became something more. She became a survivor. And that is the greatest victory of all. Thanks for watching this story all the way to the end. Your support means everything to us. If this story moved you, please remember to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one. Together, we can make sure that stories like Destiny's are never forgotten, and that the lessons they teach are never lost. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.